In this video, we're going to take a look at Photoshop's path tool options that are available to us, and just to kind of set a groundwork for you for understanding how paths work. They're very similar to the marquee tools and the lasso tools that we looked at in earlier videos, with one huge exception, and this is the exception that sets them apart. And that is, while we can draw shapes and designs and all of that freehand options with the path tools, just like the lasso tools and the marquee tools, the path tools remain editable, which means that once we create them, we can still edit them, we can shape them, and those editings and shapes don't affect the resolution at all in any way, shape, or form, which is a huge benefit for us because we can use that to our advantage in a number of ways and use that benefit to apply special effects and those types of things to our photographs, to our graphic designs, and so on. So let's take a look at the Path Tools palettes, and it's in this section right here. You'll notice that the first choice here we have the pen tool, free form pen tool, add an anchor point, delete an anchor point, convert point tool. We're going to look at this grouping later. We have the type, which is also in the paths area for the same basic reason. Type is editable, just like our paths are, because it's created using outlines, path outlines. Next we have the path selection tool and the direct selection tool. We'll look at those a little later. The last choice that we have is rectangle tool, the rounded rectangle tool, ellipse tool, polygon tool, line tool, and custom shape tool. And this is where we're going to start, because it's pretty much the most straightforward version. These are very similar to the marquee tools, as I mentioned, except that they're editable. Now, there's one more thing that I want to point out here, and that's here at the top. You'll notice that we have a number of choices. We have the tool mode. This fill usually corresponds to the foreground color, and that is what color our path is filled with whenever we create it. For instance, we have the rectangular path tool selected, so whenever we use that to create a rectangle, it will automatically fill with this green. And of course, we can change that color at any time. You also notice that we can adjust a stroke color. So if we want to add a stroke, which is basically an outline around the shape, we can determine the color that we want that outline to be, and its thickness, and the type of line that we want around it. So maybe we want a solid line, a dash line, or a dotted line. We can also even control how the corners should be, whether we want them square or rounded or beveled. If we have straight lines, how they would end as a square edge, a rounded edge, or a square edge that goes beyond the center point. And the same with a line. We can control how everything aligns with the other. Okay, so a lot of flexibility. And then you also notice that we have the ability to determine the width and the height of our shape that we're creating, in this case a rectangle. And then these are alignment and application layers, like how they align to other objects and where they are in a layer arrangement setup and all of that. Some of these tools you probably won't use as much, but let's get into actually creating something. It's very straightforward. I'm just going to left mouse click and drag, and whenever I release, we create a path. And you'll notice that it also creates a new layer in the layers panel. You also notice that the shape shows up in the paths tab. Okay, now once I created this path, you'll notice that the tools for editing the path popped up, and it shows us our width and height. It shows all of the information, just essentially what you see up here. How much we can go in and control this and adjust this accordingly. So for instance, let's say that we wanted to change this green. I can choose the color here and say I'd rather go with this orange. If I click on the orange, it will automatically change it to the orange. Okay, I don't have to hit fill or do anything like that. It does it automatically. We can also apply gradients from the gradients palette just by simply clicking a button. Alright, we can apply patterns, which we haven't really looked at patterns much, but these are some of the default patterns like cork that comes with Photoshop, so we can apply those as well. Or we can keep it completely blank with nothing in it at all. Okay, so let's stay with a solid, and we'll stay with maybe this orange here. And if we wanted to add an outline to it, we can just simply click on the stroke area to select it, choose a color that we want, say maybe a dark brown, and then we can determine how thick we want that to be just by moving the slider, or we can type in that information as well. Maybe we want to have the lines dotted or solid. It's entirely up to you. And of course we can physically adjust the dimensions of this as well, although it's literally editable at any given point in time. One more thing that I'll point out, you'll notice that even though we drew a rectangle, we have the ability to round the edges. Okay, and I can type in a number of pixels that'll determine the rounding of it, or you notice that whenever I mouse over one of the corners, it turns into a directional arrow. Because this button here in the middle is clicked, this constricts the proportions, and so everything is linked together, as you can see. So watch what happens if I just left mouse click and drag. Notice how it's changing the shape. It's rounding the corners. And because the chain is checked, it will automatically do that for all four corners, and whenever I release, it's automatically adjusted. But let's say that I don't want to change all of them. Let's say I just want to change this one. So now I can go in and affect just that corner. Turn it back to a square. Select this one. I could turn it back to a square, and so now we end up with this shape where our corners, let's increase this even more to say 95. And let's say I want this one to match, so I could key in 95 as well. And so you can see very easily we're able to adjust shapes and size and all that kind of stuff. We can also control the width and the height. Like let's say I want it to be more narrow, instead of 190 pixels, maybe make it 120. And everything automatically adjusts to allow for that. So it really is cool and amazing what you can do with the paths tool and the adjustment palettes and everything, just by working with the options that you have available to you. The same is true. We do have the ability to create a rounded rectangle straight from the word go. And this can especially come in handy if you want to make like web graphics, buttons, and those kinds of things. So I could create an option like that, maybe turn the stroke off. Okay. And perhaps let's apply gradient, or no, hold on. Let's apply gradient fill. And we'll just select this copper one here, and you'll notice how it's applying. It actually has some dimensionality to it. And you know what, let's actually put a border around it, but just a thin border. And color wise, let's choose maybe a brown. And so now whenever I deselect the image, I'll just click off of that layer. We basically have a three-dimensional shape, and what's cool about it is that we can edit this and scale it and do whatever we want at any given time, which brings us to these tools here, the path selection tool and the direct selection tool. These are different. The path selection tool allows you to select a path. Okay, let me turn that path on. So now you want to make sure you're on the right layer. So whenever I click that, it allows me to select the entire path. Okay, so if I try to say click on one of these points to scale or something like that, it just moves it. So essentially it's kind of like the move tool for paths, okay, as opposed to the direct selection tool, which gives you the ability to select specific points. And the reason why you'd want to do that is because you may want to edit them. Okay, for instance, let's say I take this point right here, and let me zoom in here a little bit just so you can see this a bit more pronounced. So if I click on just this point, you'll notice that I can bring it down and it'll change. It'll change the shape of it. You'll notice that also we have these extenders here that allow us to edit the shape of the curves. And so it gives us the ability to create something that's different than just a typical shape that we may use. Okay, so then if I zoom back in, or out rather, you can see where it's taken on a different form. So that's the difference between path select tool versus direct select. So path select always just selects the entire path. It's not an editing tool at all. It's just basically a move tool, as opposed to the direct selection tool, which gives us the ability to edit a specific edit point on the path itself. Okay. One other thing that I want to point out here before we move on, with the shapes, all the shapes pretty much work the same. The one exception is the custom shape tool. And if we select that, we have the fill right now set to this blend, and I'm going to change that to just a solid color. And by the way, you'll notice that because this selection or this path was selected, that it did change that color. If I hit undo or use history here to undo that and have this path deselected, okay, then come to the shape tool and change the fill color, it won't affect the existing path. Well, actually it shouldn't. I guess it is because I'm on that layer. But let's say we want to go with a solid. And one of the key differences here with the shape tool is that it gives us the ability to create unusual shapes other than just circles and rectangles and those kinds of things. So for instance, over here on the far right, you'll notice that another option has been added, and that is shapes. And Photoshop comes with a variety of shapes that we can choose from. Arrows and animal shapes, all kinds of arrows. Starbursts and waves, picture frames, musical notes, all sorts of objects that you may want to use in your designs. Okay, there's talk bubbles. So like for instance, let's say that you wanted to create a custom arrow for a web design that you're creating. So we could choose this arrow 12, and whenever I draw it, it gives me the ability to create this shape on demand, and it will take on the fill and the stroke, whatever I've chosen to make it. And of course I can go in and change those options as well. I can change the color to say a red and make the stroke black. Okay. We could even add to the fill, we can make it a gradient. So let's say, click on the white here and make it a red. Notice that we can also change the angle. It's a linear blend, and it's set at 90 degrees. I can just tick this around to right here to 0, and so now the red is starting on the right and blending to the black. If I double click the black, I could change it to maybe a darker red. Change this to a lighter red. So, you know, a lot of flexibility that we have in editing these colors, even in the custom shapes. And as long as this shape is chosen and you have the custom shape tool selected, you can draw as many arrows as you want. And you'll notice that they will always still point to the right. And you might think, well, what if I don't want them to point to the right? Well, that's okay. If you come up to edit and transform, you notice that before, whenever we were using the transform, it was for pixel-based objects, like the marquee tool that we were using. We were adjusting those. Now you notice that it says transform path, and so we can actually choose rotate and rotate the path around, and then hit enter to apply it, and so now our arrow is pointing up. Okay, so those are the shape tools and the direct select tool. We're going to get into more of the direct select tool in a minute. Next, we're going to look at the pen tool, and the pen tool gives us the ability to draw different types of shapes other than the ones that we were looking at, and it's very similar to the polygonal lasso tool in that whenever you click, it draws a straight line, and then another one, and so on. But unlike the polygonal lasso tool, the pen tool gives us the ability to edit our shape at any given time. And you'll notice that once I get back to the starting point, see how the little circle appears below the pen. So whenever I click on that, it closes the shape. Now at the top here, you'll notice that we have some options. We can choose what we want to do with this shape. We can choose to make it a selection, a mask, or we can turn it into its own shape layer. And you'll notice that whenever I click that, it puts it on its own layer, and it filled it with our foreground color, just like the other shapes would be naturally. So then we can go in and edit our shape at any given time. And of course, how we would do that is to, once again, choose the direct selection tool, and then I can select one point and drag it down, and it'll edit our shape. Okay, let's say that you add a point in here and you decide, you know what, I probably shouldn't have added that point. Well, if you left mouse click and hold the pen tool down, you'll notice that we have add anchor point, delete anchor point. If we choose delete anchor point, when we click on a point, you'll notice how the little minus appears in the pen. When I click on it, it removes it. The same is true if we choose the add anchor point anywhere along the path. Whenever the little pen and plus sign appear, if I click, it creates a point. Okay, and then we can go in and use the direct selection tool to edit that point. Now you'll notice that by default, it added a point that's a natural curve. It's a natural, evenly balanced Bezier curve. And that gives us some advantages from an editing perspective. But let's say that you don't want it to be that way, that you want it to be a sharp cornered edge. Well, you also notice one of our choices here under the pen tool is convert point tool. And I'll show you how it works. If I select that and just click on this point that we created, watch what happens. Okay. It removes the adjustment points on it and turns it into a sharp edge as a part of the path. However, let's say that we didn't want it to turn into that kind of a shape, and we clicked by mistake, or we're trying to get another effect, and we want to add a Bezier curve to our path. Like let's say over here, it's already a strong, edged corner, you'll notice. If I left mouse click, and instead of just clicking and releasing, if I left mouse click and drag, you notice that it adds Bezier curve points. Now, check this out. Let me make this a little bit more pronounced. I'm going to move this point up higher. And so you'll notice that right now, both sides of the the edit point here moves simultaneously. Okay. Now, if I choose the convert point tool and click on just one of these points, like this one over here, okay, watch what happens now. Now I can edit and move this one independent from the one that's there. Not by clicking on the center point, but by clicking on this extension here. Okay, so it's really a cool feature that the path tools offer to you, because it gives us the ability to really edit these paths to whatever shape we need them to be. Now, the other tool that we have here, of course, is the freeform pen tool, and it works very similar to the lasso tool in that you can draw freeform, just whatever shape you want. Notice the circle appearing, so that'll close it. And then it smooths out our drawing and adds in anchor points wherever it feels that they belong best. Okay, and then we can go in, of course, and edit those as we see fit. Now, let's take our pen tool experience, if you will, and apply it to a real-world environment working with a photograph. So I have the tomatoes up here, and I want to show you a really neat feature of using these pen tools. Okay, one of the things that I love about the pen tool is that it gives us the ability to actually go in and isolate elements of a photograph and get very, very precise. You might remember before where we silhouetted out part of one of the tomatoes. The pen tool makes it infinitely easier because you can edit those points at any given time. So I'm going to zoom in here a little bit, and I'm going to turn on another feature that I had pointed out briefly before, and that is the magnetic option. And basically what the magnetic option does, you'll notice that there's a little magnet next to the pen tool now. So it essentially gives the pen tool the ability to detect edges. So whenever I click and start painting, really drawing, you notice that the pen tool is following along the edge of the tomato. Yes, I'm close and in the ballpark, but it is recognizing that edge, and it's adding points in a very linear fashion. You notice that they're fairly evenly spaced out, not completely. I can also click to add points myself, or I can hold the mouse button down as I'm drawing, and it'll add a lot more points, which you really don't need to do that. Just allow the program to figure it out for itself, or add them yourself. So I'm just following around the shape of the tomato, and you notice that even though I'm varying a little bit left or right, it's still hugging the edge of that tomato like there's no tomorrow. And then whenever I click, it removes all the extra points and reduces it down to just a few that it thinks that I need, which are still too many. So the next thing I can do then is go in and delete a bunch of these extra anchor points. You know, I'm going to delete a lot of them just to kind of prove the flexibility that you have with these adjustment bars. Alright, so now that we've removed a lot of them, you notice that we're not quite as form-fitting to our tomato. So I'm going to go back here and choose the direct selection tool, and then I can pick a specific point and start to fine-tune how the path is interacting with the shape that I want to achieve. And let's zoom in here just a little bit more so you can see. So I can get very, very precise. I'll just increase that a little bit. And so now it just becomes a matter of fine-tuning how these curves are fitting to the tomato. And by the way, you can always add more points if you need to, if you're trying to get something to wrap around and it won't quite happen, you can always add more points. So maybe reposition this puppy here a little bit. And once in a while you get these points that are unruly. Notice how it's stacked on top of each other. So what I'll often do in that case is choose convert point and just click on it and then create a new one. That way I can go back to editing the way I want to. There's no Bezier curve point that's going to tell me what to do. And so we just apply the last little bit of editing here. And you notice I can be extremely form-fitting around this tomato, which is awesome. It just really gives you a level of control that's hard to achieve using the lasso tool, because you just can't be that precise. You can't go in and re-edit after the fact. So once I'm happy with my end result, I can I have a couple options. You notice that I can right mouse click and I can make a selection from this path that we just created, which is what I want to do. So I'm going to make a selection, and I can choose to feather it, which very often if I'm isolating an object out of a photo, I'll feather it by 1 pixel, but you don't have to. I'll click OK, and it turns it into a selection. And now I can copy and paste, Control C to copy, Control V to paste. And you'll notice if I turn off the background layer, we have a perfectly silhouetted tomato. Okay, let me zoom out just so you can see. And so that's really the power of paths when working with photographs.